Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, Slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and as the summer is gradually starting to trail away, and you wake up in the morning and you're getting that sense of fall being in the air, I know that I certainly am, and with that is back to school time. So for many of us who have kids, I know for me, I do have that one kid going off to college on Saturday, which, holy cow. Actually, let me tell you, I had a moment. I'm not sure if I shared this last week on the podcast. I don't think that I did. So we use we all have iPhones in the family. We have a family plan. And with that, I've always used screen time with the Apple products. So that way you can kind of track what your kids are doing, what access to apps they have, what are the ratings of things that they can watch, making sure that it's age appropriate. And it will tell you what the ages are, as you're reading through and looking at your family. So for myself, it says organizer. For my wife, it's like co-organizer. And then it would have all the kids and their ages. Talk about a weird, bittersweet thing that you don't think about until you see it. So I have my youngest, and it says, age 14. And then there's, my middle one, and it says age 16. And then gets to my oldest, and it says adult. And I just looked at it for a moment, kind of in shock a little bit. Like, holy cow, how did we get here? How did we get here so quickly? And it's one of those things that, you can lament the past and maybe how you wish you would have done things better or differently. I certainly think of that as a husband, as a father, as a human being. And to see that adult and to know, at least seemingly, and obviously going off to college, we're going to put a test. There's going to be a bit of a test as far as how good of a human being we have formed here. But it was just this sobering moment of just looking at it and going, wow, here we are. Adulthood has arrived. Now I keep telling him, I'm like, look, the federal government said that, you got to be on my insurance till age 26, which coincidentally is right around the same time that the human brain finally is fully developed, which is why they talk about very strongly not doing, alcohol, drugs, etc. Like those are the ages that kids will go off to college and they start partying and doing all those things. Brain is still very much developing. So not to get into any, socio-political stuff, but just remember the brain continues to be forming and growing all the way through the mid-20s, which just gives a whole nother shocking view of mankind from, the first Homo sapiens to today, and think about what different ages have had to experience throughout all of these millennia. Still kids, literally the brain still growing, still forming, still not fully mature until age 26. Mind-blowing. But the point of all this, back to school time. Back to school time is upon us again. And a couple more weeks for the younger two before they head off to high school. One of my kids is going to be a junior. One's going to be a freshman in high school. So all the kids are in high school or above. Again, there's this moment in time. Like, holy cow. We are getting old. And for those of you who are on the older side of Gen X, all of your kids are grown. Some of you. Many of you probably. Already grown, off in their first jobs. Like, that's all mind-blowing to me that this is where we are in life. So anyway, I thought about high school. high school movies. What are some of the best movies that are set in high school? Now, I had gone fairly late, and I always talk about keeping it in what I think is a reasonable time frame where a majority of us along the entire spectrum of Gen X would be relatable. Now, I also try to, as often as possible, have casts that are essentially Gen X casts. Now, that isn't always possible because a lot of the times, particularly in the early 80s, early to mid 80s, now this still happens today, don't get me wrong, and that is people well into their 20s playing teens. That's just Hollywood. The magic of, TV and film is, one, people look incredibly youthful for such a long time, but then you sometimes watch it and you go, wait a minute, this person is clearly in their 20s and they're playing a teen and it just doesn't look right. So anyway, why don't we start off with probably I don't want to say the most classic of them, but certainly I think if you're Gen X, you relate to this. So let me see. My computer's being a little stupid at the moment. So bear with me just a second. I almost logged off, which would have been a problem. I have my notes, so I apologize. I last week was probably, based upon listenership, not the strongest of my episodes, and admittedly it wasn't. And a lot of my time was spent obviously talking about my daughter's experience in Maui, and the topic itself, maybe didn't relate as well as, other episodes. So I think we're back at it. I was obviously a little bit distracted with everything that was, going on, with my daughter. But here we are. So let's go to the tried and true classic, right? The one that many look at as being like the preeminent coming of age film, right? And it has a director who's going to be on the list more than once, but also, interestingly enough, a screenplay writer that is well known for making movies that definitely speak to Gen X. So I'm talking about the classic 1982 Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Of course, starring it's an all-star cast. Sorry, I'm going to have a little bit of an echo here for a moment as I adjust the microphone here. Sorry, folks. Terrible noise, but I've been doing some research on how to get a little bit better sound quality here. And I'm not doing myself any favors at the moment with sound quality. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully this is back to where we were. Okay. So the cast itself, I just have to say, is heavily boomer driven. Okay. Heavily boomer driven. And that's where I was like, do I include it? But it's still such a part of Americana and the history of like the high school flick, right? So this cast, Sean Penn, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Judge Reinhold, Phoebe Cates, Brian Backer. You have Nicolas Cage, Eric Stoltz, Forrest Whitaker, Anthony Edwards. I mean, between film and TV, you have like such a tremendous cast of young people. Now, bearing in mind that many of them, so we'll use an example, Sean Penn was 22 years old. 22 years old when this came out. And this was coming off of his first film, which was Taps, right? Which, Tom Cruise's like first or second movie. So these are the generation just before and sometimes intertwined with, the whole Brat Pack that I talked about on one of the episodes. So go check out the Brat Pack episode. But these are three kind of interchangeable stories that is based upon a book which was written by Cameron Crowe, right? Who did things like Say Anything. Not Say Anything. Was that Cameron Crowe? Yeah, Say Anything. Singles. Jerry Maguire, Almost Famous, right? So this guy who is a firm boomer, born in 1957, has made some of these movies that I think are so relatable. But there's these intertwining stories. You have Brad and Stacy, Mike Damone, Jeff Spicoli, obviously, Spicoli's relationship with Mr. Hand. Aloha, Mr. Hand. It's just such an interesting view because when you also consider the time period, there's also some social commentary in here as well, in particularly when you think about Stacy's story. So not to get too much into it, but obviously, no spoilers here. It's, however many years old now. But, Stacy getting pregnant and opting for an abortion, which was supposed to have been somewhat covered by the father, which was Mike Damone, right? That takes a very serious turn, right? So that's one of those elements of a lot of comedy, a lot of over-the-top, like quirky stuff, but also very relevant to the time, which I think is what Cameron Crowe has always done tremendously well. But the director of this film, Amy Heckerling, is an amazing director, and she'll be up on the list again very, very soon. Outside of the high school genre, National Lampoon's European Vacation, Look Who's Talking. I mean, just such an interesting filmography, but obviously very, very good at, look at this filmography, right? So, Getting It Over With, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Johnny Dangerously with, Joe Piscopo, National Lampoon's European Vacation, Look Who's Talking 2, Look Who's Talking Now, the movie that we'll talk about shortly, A Night at the Roxbury, Molly, Loser, I Can Never Be Your Woman, and Vamps. And then a bunch of television work as well, including directing an episode of The Office. So that's our first one. I couldn't keep it off the list, even though a majority of the cast is, in fact, boomers. So next, we have what I think is one of, our movies, very firmly. And it's also a movie that I've mentioned before that was a little bit prescient as far as what was going to happen or could happen within the context of high school. And I'm talking about 1989's Heathers. Here's the cast. You have Winona Ryder as Veronica Sawyer. Winona Ryder, icon of our generation. Christian Slater, same thing as Jason J.D. Dean. And Jason, what a Gen X name, I should know. And then one of the three Heathers of the title is Shannon Doherty as Heather Duke. Now, obviously, Shannon Doherty, Little House on the Prairie, Charmed, Beverly Hills 90210, an icon in of herself with failing health at this point, and it's a very sad story. But then you have the other two Heathers, Lisa Ann Falk as Heather McNamara and Kim Walker as Heather Chandler. So for anyone who hasn't seen Heathers, I would say that Christian Slater's character is, misanthropic. He is nihilistic, perhaps a bit sadistic, and certainly psychopathic. And the seemingly naive, or at least initially naive, Veronica Sawyer, played by Winona Ryder, who is part of this crew of Heathers, while she herself is not, in fact, a Heather. So therefore, she is somewhat on the outside looking in, just by default. But where they all wear very bright colors, even from the beginning, Veronica tends to wear rather dark colors. A little gothic, on brand for Winona at that particular time, particularly when you think about Beetlejuice and stuff like that, playing the goth girl, which she's done very well. And just to see her now playing the middle-aged mom on Stranger Things is such a full circle kind of thing there, And then my wife and I, we watched the, what's it called? It was she and Keanu Reeves. It's Wedding Guest or something like that. Winona Ryder. What was it? It was actually quite enjoyable. I'm not saying that it was like a great, film by any stretch of the imagination, but it was just fun. And also the fact that you had her with Keanu Reeves for the first time. Destination Wedding, right? I mean, it's just likable enough. It's just the two of them. You know what I mean? As one put it, one reviewer says, a stubbornly unfunny 86 minutes that feels a lot longer. Anyway, not to go off on a tangent, I actually enjoyed it. It was overwritten, but they're both so good that it was fun anyway. And it was such a homage to like the movies that they were in, including movies like Heathers, which had a lot of dazzling dialogue that were being, delivered with this wry sarcasm, it's such great delivery. And of course, Christian Slater being just so good at that dry, just snark. So good at it. So I have to put, Heathers on the list. And of course, JD's character is psychopathic, homicidal. They stage numerous murders. And of course, the quarterback and the linebacker, the center, they set them up as having been closeted gay lovers. There's poisoning. There's then the attempt to blow up the entire school, which when you look at it from 1989, it's 10 years later, basically, that we get Columbine, right? So it's like this disaffected youth was very much a thing that came out of Gen X. And then, of course, there's the hit song, Teenage Suicide, Don't Do It, which, of course, was spawned by the actions of JD and Veronica. So also, if I have this right, and I did, I took all my notes here, trying to get back to, when you have a review that says, professional and informative, better get on it. So also 1989, we have, oddly enough, a non-bearded Robin Williams drama. So normally Robin Williams, he grows the beard. It's going to be a dramatic role. Instead, we have 1989's Dead Poets Society, directed by Peter Weir and written by Tom Schulman. And it is set in 1959 at the fictional Welton Academy. And of course, we have Robin Williams, who is playing John Keating, who's the new English teacher at this very hoity-toity, very traditional boarding school. He, of course, being Robin Williams, is over the top and challenging and exciting. And we've all had, I shouldn't say all, I only have had a couple of teachers in my entire life from high school through college that really got me going the way that John Keating as a character was able to get these kids going. You have Robert Sean Leonard as Neil, as the lead of the story, who is also, I think, best known for his turn on House. And then Ethan Hawke as Todd. Here you have Keating coming in, challenging them, and Neil's character, Robert Sean Leonard, his father is played by Kurtwood Smith, who, of course, depending on your viewpoint, you think of him as the bad guy from RoboCop, or you think of him as Red from That 70s Show. He plays Neil's overbearing father, who then loses his shit when his son takes up theater. Because, obviously, 1959, there's going to be all kinds of connotations, both then as there are now, if you're a kid in the theater program. And he was not liking that and pulled him out of the school, embarrassed him, pulled him out, which, of course, ends tragically. And then the aftermath of... So again, things that we unfortunately see and hear all the time. And, a teenage suicide. Again, just talked about Heathers, teenage suicide, don't do it. And how, this fragile youth with this overbearing father who has finally found a way to express himself in a meaningful way gets it all taken away and ultimately takes his own life. And how parents who are in this state of grieving are always looking for reasons and answers. And sometimes the reasons that they find aren't necessarily truly what's occurred. But I think Dead Poet Society has to be on the list for great high school movies of Gen X. Similarly, so of course, Heathers takes place in a public high school. Dead Poet Society, a private high school. And here we are with School Ties in 1992. Now let's talk about casts, okay? just as we have with Dead Poet Society and Heathers, future stars everywhere. Brendan Fraser, David Green. He's an amazing football player, a quarterback, also happens to be Jewish at a time with the time period that this is set. Let's see, what year was this supposed to be? Not that anti-Semitism doesn't still exist. So this is 1955. So 1955, you have a kid who's a Jewish kid from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who gets to go to St. Matthew's Academy, an exclusive Massachusetts prep school. Now, I live in Massachusetts. I've lived in the Northeast my whole life. I've had, growing up, so I've mentioned it before, like, Meriden was very diverse. I didn't say inclusive, but definitely diverse. So I was exposed to a lot of people. And like one of my longest, most steady bosses was like this Jewish guy who was just like a pillar of the community. Like everyone loved him. I never looked, I'm sure there were people that I didn't know about, but like all of the, the top business guys in the community, like all respected this guy immensely. I never really heard of anti-Semitism, really. And even from back home, if you're like, oh yeah, dude, do you not hear about that? I never did. So it's just one of those things that it's so unfortunate to think about people experiencing this, whether it's 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. It's like, I don't know. I don't get prejudice. Anyway, not to go off on a tangent. I guess I understand prejudice. I don't understand racism and anti-Semitism. Like, I don't get aggressive anger at someone for being just alive. Anyway, so he's this amazing football player and he gets to go to this elite school and he already feels like an outcast and he hides the fact that he's Jewish for like the first third of the movie. But again, talking about the cast. So Brendan Fraser, you have Matt Damon as Charlie Dillon. And this is kind of the big bad. He's the bad guy. Matt Damon at his absolute douchiest. Chris O'Donnell, right? Cole Hauser, one of my favorites, plays a baddie, better than just about anyone, by the way. Anthony Rapp, who's been in a ton of stuff, but unfortunately, has been in the news over the past 5-6 years because of allegations against Kevin Spacey from when he was a teenager. And then finally, Ben Affleck, because where there is Matt Damon, there is Ben Affleck. But think about that cast, multiple Oscar nominees. And of course, Matt Damon and Ben Affleck won an Oscar for Best Screenplay for Good Will Hunting. And then, of course, Brendan Fraser most recently won the Academy Award for Best Actor. I'd have to go through the list and see what other awards some of these folks have had, but certainly everything from, Golden Globes to multiple nominations, I think, for everyone. Did Affleck end up winning one for anything else? I feel like he did. Let's see. This is more of a curiosity. Sorry, a little detour here. Filmography and awards. He's a recipient of 2 Academy Awards. Oh, shoot, that's right. He was the director of Argo, which won Best Picture. So he has a Best Original Screenplay and a Best Picture under his belt. And won 3 Golden Globes, Best Screenplay for Good Will Hunting, Best Director for Argo, and Best Motion Picture for Argo at the Golden Globes. Was he nominated for Best Director? It seems like if you win Best Movie, you should be nominated, right? Oh, as someone says here, Ben Affleck got robbed. Well, there you go. There you go. And even guys who were directors on other movies that were nominated were like, dude, he should have got it. Okay. So, moving on. Next, I couldn't exclude this one from the list. I mean, how could I possibly? So for me, I was in middle school when I saw this for the first time, and I've talked about it before. particularly on the Brat Pack episode. And I'm, of course, talking about The Breakfast Club. I think much like Fast Times, you had the later boomers and early Gen Xers who were in high school or just out of high school kind of thing, who were like totally relatable. Except I think Breakfast Club, more so than Fast Times, this is just my opinion, is, I guess, I think it's more universal in the fact that I think it holds up because the themes themselves, it just feels like just such a lived in story, and one that generation after generation after generation, like, this isn't necessarily a movie that forces you to think about it being in 1985. Certainly some of the movies and of course the fashion, but the actual stories themselves, everything from things that we experience in terms of class differences, right? Which is purely economic. You have some obvious mental disorders, right? Poor parental relationships, just a bunch of different things that are, and just how people get pigeonholed. And this is who you are because either your peers, your family, or even sometimes the adults who are supposed to be the adults and know better put kids into these very rigid roles, and how difficult it is to get past that. That's where I think Breakfast Club will forever hold up, and generation after generation will see this movie and go, yep, totally get it. So we're going to start right from the start. What words were those even? Okay. So Emilio Estevez as Andrew Clark. He is the jock, right? And he is there because he tapes Larry Lester's butt cheeks together with duct tape, and the dude was super hairy. And he felt peer pressured into doing it. He didn't feel good about it after he did it. Like, in the moment, everyone's laughing. And then the tape had to come off. And it tore all this hair out painfully, And that kid didn't deserve it. And he felt bad about it. But even like his dad would be like, oh, that's what you do, man. Yeah, right. Kind of egging on the bullying, brutish behavior. And that was part of his story. The expectation, like, you're the jock, you're the dude. You do that stuff and it's okay. Conversely, you have Anthony Michael Hall as Brian Johnson, and he is the nerd. He's a dork. And of course, he got busted for bringing a flare gun. Not a handgun, not a Glock, right? But he was going to use the flare gun to commit suicide. So again, a theme we have here, teenage suicide. It's unfortunate that this is still a thing, but again, the brain, these expectations, and even just how as teenagers, I think of that song by Blink-182. Oh gosh. I just listened to it the other day. Is it Brian's song? No, Brian's song is a movie, right? This is me spitballing, and I hadn't thought about this when I was, doing my notes for the episode, but it just hit me now. There's this great video that came out of an announcer, a baseball announcer, doing the whole, where are you? It's so good. It's of Enema of the State, right? What great titles. Adam's song, not Brian's song. So Adam's song. And, that's a song that is about teenage suicide. And one of the things that it talks about, trace the cord back to the wall, turned out wasn't plugged in at all. So to the teenage mind, it was, no one calls me, no one cares about me. And here it was that you weren't getting any calls because the phone wasn't plugged in, right? And how that whole perception was so powerful that it took the young man to Adam in the song. Line that always gets me, though, is please tell mom this is not her fault. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. So anyway, for those of you who have teenagers, one of the lines in that song too is, to spend time in my room alone. You just gotta check in on them. You know what I mean? Check in on them, knock on the door. What's going on? Sometimes it's all it takes. And they might tell you, get out, leave me alone. I'm good, whatever. Better check. So anyway, Brian Johnson, not to be confused with the lead singer for AC/DC, but his parents' constant pressure to get good grades is what drove him to try and kill himself. Like he can't live up to this pressure, this expectation. So, of course, you have Judd Nelson as John Bender, who is the criminal, right? He's locked into this role. This is who you are, right? And, of course, why is he there? Pulled the fire alarm. Pulled the fire alarm. And, of course, always talking smack to the vice principal. Now, I've talked about it on the show before. Vice principals in particular, I've had more than my fair share of run-ins. And I get that they kind of get locked into that role as well. The vice principal is always going to be the bad guy. So that way the principal can either be the super good guy, good cop, bad cop, or then have to be the one who delivers like the bad news of, hey, your kid's getting expelled. But the vice principals are always suspensions, and they get to kind of talk some smack too. But the whole thing with Bender's character, and you end up finding this out as it's going along, is that he's being abused at home, right? His father burns him for spilling paint in the garage, burns him with a cigar, puts a cigar out on his own son's arm. And then you wonder why he's lashing out at the world, right? Because to him, any attention that you get, whether it's good attention or bad attention, and is probably more used to negative attention, well, great, I'm going to pull the fire alarm. I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to talk back to the vice principal. What are you going to do? It can't be any worse than what's happened to me at home. Awful. So, that's terrible, but also I think something very relatable for many people. Molly Ringwald, who at this point is like the darling of all of these movies. And we're going to talk about a couple of omissions that some of you might say, well, what about this one? Or what about that one? And why I chose what I chose. So she is Claire Standish. And Claire, of course, is an old lady's name. One of my very first crushes was this girl, Claire, making eyes across the music room because we were in music class together. My God, I could have stared into her eyes for a million years. But I never asked her out. Why? I'm stupid. Anyway, I'm a happy married man now. But back then, it was like, why don't you do that? Such a nerd. Anyway, she is the princess. She's the princess who has one very interesting skill, which is how she puts on her lipstick, which of course Bender makes her real bad about. But why is she there? Skip school. To do what? Go shopping. And everyone looks at the princess and thinks of, oh, she's perfect and she's rich and she's all that. Meanwhile, her parents, they're probably going to get divorced. And she gets stuck in the middle of their arguments, right? They use her as bargaining, but as ways to attack each other. Use the kids. Awful, petty, mean things that people go through. Things aren't so easy for her. Speaking of not easy, you have Ali Sheedy as Allison Reynolds, the basket case. So again, these are the things that they call themselves, right? The brain, the criminal, the princess, the athlete, the basket case. Who was not there because she got in trouble. She just goes because there's nothing better to do. And her parents neglect her and ignore her. And she thinks about running away. So think about that, right? And this is what's so beautiful about the story. Andrew, the athlete, second generation athlete, probably third generation athlete. His father was an athlete. His grandfather was an athlete. He has, parents who look at him like he can do no wrong and like he's great and wonderful. But you gotta be the dude, right? Very much a part of his life. You have Brian as the brain. His parents, always on his case. Got to make sure you get an A. Got to get an A. Got to get an A. Oh, you got a C? What was it? And then like pottery or some shit. Anyway, Bender, he's the criminal. He gets attention from his father. Not good attention, but he gets it. Sometimes in the form of a fist or a cigar or verbally abused. You have Claire, whose parents are using her as a pawn in their messy divorce. But here's Ali Sheedy's character, Allison, who's just neglected. And they don't talk to her. They don't pay attention to her. She's just someone who kind of lives there. Like, hey, we created this person and okay, live your life. Right? I mean, so all of those are such very real things. Like neglect is, possibly one of the worst forms of abuse. It's just withholding all of your love. It's withholding, true emotion, interactivity. Awful. But rounding out the cast is you have your two, adult leads. You have Paul Gleason killing it as Richard Vernon, the badass vice principal of Shermer High School. He is nasty to others, including like the janitor. You know what I mean? And he's totally rude to Bender. And he kind of looks at them as the adult. He looks at them as all of these things that they kind of have been locked into by their peers. So this is where I say, like, sometimes the problem with school life is that the teachers and the administrators are not immune from kids getting pigeonholed. And they don't mean to. It just kind of happens, And he judges them the same way. And then Carl, the janitor, who just seems nice enough, but John Capelos, who it's interesting going through his filmography and remembering, oh my gosh, he was on Miami Vice, but he's been in a bunch of stuff. But, he kind of has to remind Vernon, like, dude, like, first of all, do you even remember what it was like to be a kid? And it's so unfortunate that we lose that part of ourselves where we can't relate to what's really happening, to look at a kid and go, this kid's really struggling, and they need help, not more shit heaped on them. So anyway, Breakfast Club, I know I did the deepest dive into that, but to this day, I mean, it's such a deep flick and also fun, but poignant and very telling and a great reflection of life, not just in the 80s, but just human nature. So finally, I mentioned Amy Heckerling, who, of course, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But 1995, this is a classic. It is. And you look at the cast and you go, oh my gosh, yes, these are some, again, later Xers or mid to late Xers might look at it a little bit differently than, your early Xers, but Clueless. Alicia Silverstone as Cher Horowitz. Stacey Dash, Dionne Davenport. The late Brittany Murphy as Ty Frazier. The immortal Paul Rudd as Josh Lucas. Donald Faison as Murray Duvall. Now, I don't remember Eliza Donovan as Amber and, Breckin Meyer as Travis Birkenstock. Jeremy Sisto as Elton Tisha. And Dan Hedaya as Cher's dad. And, of course, I always think of Dan from his time on Cheers. Love Cheers. And he was Carla's ex-husband. Anyway, Clueless, I remember not having any interest in seeing this movie, right? And I go over a buddy of mine's house. I had this random roommate. But anyway, so this is Drew, who I've mentioned before. And killer guitar player. And, he was playing some music that he had been working on. And they had HBO. They'd either just gotten or something like that. He's like, oh, dude. No, you know what? We just finished watching Night on Earth, which is Jim Jarmusch, right? Antonio Bignini, Tom Waits, Winona Ryder, great cast. And Clueless came on afterwards. And he's like, would you care for a cup of tea? Straight edge at the time. He's always been straight edge. Like, I would love a cup of tea. And we know, just sitting there having some tea, and this turns on, and we just start watching it. And we're just sucked in from like the very earliest moment. Then his roommate comes out. Oh gosh, what is her name? It's been way too long. I'm never going to remember it. Anyway, she comes out. What are you guys watching? Oh, we're watching Clueless. She goes, oh, let's watch. Next 2 hours or whatever it is. Just in on the ride. And I think a lot of that has to be because of Amy Heckerling's ability to direct these movies that have a lot of comedy, but also serious elements, And I mean, I think this is probably, and this is why people will say it's classic in and of itself, but like Alicia Silverstone, she's done a couple of really good roles, but this was not only just a breakthrough, but an amazing performance. And then, Paul Rudd. Now, you look back on it, and I'm not sure this movie could be made in 2023. Because even though step siblings are about as far from being actual siblings, depending on if you like grew up with them, but like that's like almost considered like taboo. Step stuff, it's not incestuous. They're not related. Unfortunately, too many people are on the internet looking at, nasty stuff that makes this a whole meme. Oh, stepbrother, stepsister. But the other piece of it is the age difference. So Josh is in college and Cher is still in high school. That all of a sudden, when I say all of a sudden, I mean probably the last 5-10 years has become more and more taboo as well. So I don't think it could be made today. It would be looking at as Josh as a creep and a freak, and it's completely wrong on so many different levels. I think within the context of the story and the time, it didn't seem out of place. It didn't seem weird. It didn't seem like, oh, this guy is like way too old and he's like a creeper kind of thing. It seemed very organic and very real. But anyway, I had to put it on the list as like one of the best high school movies, because you think about the different interactions and like the social groups that were happening and how Brittany Murphy's character as Ty kind of goes into this whole other realm of popularity and how it went to her head. And she kind of thought she was better than everyone else. Rolling with the homies. You have that whole side story of, Cher thinking that she's met like the love of her life, only to find out like the guy that, she thought was so great because he was well-groomed and into classic movies and classic cars. And he dressed kind of like a, 1950s, like was his whole vibe, and that he was, gay and not interested in her at all. So again, also things that were in 1995, not necessarily something that was firmly in the forefront of kind of like society. So it's also kind of an interesting movie in how many different things that it kind of encompassed. Who is that screenplay by? Let's see here. This was, written and directed by Amy Heckerling. She did both of, wow. What else has she done as a writer? I mean, really quite good. Yeah, she wrote those Look Who's Talking movies as well. But she wrote, directed, and produced Clueless. I mean, that's her baby, start to finish. That's really impressive. And and Loser. That's Jason Biggs, Mina Savari, and Greg Kinnear. I've never seen it. I've heard about it, though. And Greg Kinnear is an excellent actor. But this only has... I don't even see a audience score on this, but... yeah, doesn't have the the same overall love by the crowds and the critics as did Clueless. Pretty nice soundtrack, though. Check it out. Bad Touches on there. You and Me, Baby, Ain't Nothing But Bammels. So that is my main list of the high school movies that I would put on my list of must watch. You know, part of it is I've been talking to my son as he's going off to college. I'm like, dude, there's a bunch of movies that you got to watch. And these are movies that I would definitely, he's seen Clueless, and I think that's it. Now, I've said before, we've been very strict parents when it comes to content, and he's only been watching movies that are, you know, leaning towards R and up for like the past year. Because, like, you know, between 17 and 18, like actually making him wait till he was 17, which of course he laments when his younger brother has seen a couple of horror movies that were rated R. I don't know. Maybe we are being too lenient and babying the youngest. But that's neither here nor there. So some of the movies you might think about, why didn't you include, I don't know, 16 Candles or Pretty in Pink? I can't have just all John Hughes. And of the movies that are from that whole, you know, lineage, I think Breakfast Club is by far the best of them. I really do. I never loved 16 Candles. I always thought that was okay. You know what I mean? It was okay. Pretty in Pink, I've watched that a fair number of times. That's very, very good. And I know it does culminate in a prom, which is also very, hey, that's the high school culmination, right? Your senior prom and your senior graduation and all that. But I just basically made a judgment call as far as like the John Hughes. Now you might cry foul and say, well, wait a minute. You had Fast Times and Clueless, both directed by Amy Heckerling. I mean, they're like a decade apart, whereas that whole run of John Hughes movies was like back to back to back to back kind of thing, you know? Yeah, I just made my own judgment of what I would put on the list. Now, if I were to do like the definitive like 80s Brat Pack movies, of course those would have to be on there. But as far as like the high school flicks, these are the ones that I would put on there. You know, I'm not sure if I said it at the top of the show, but like, you know, I didn't go into that early millennial. You know, there's movies like 10 Things I Hate About You. Basically, that whole cast is all either Zennials or Millennials. So I didn't include them. You know, that was 1999, just a little bit outside the range. Although my wife would be like, what about that? Like, no, can't be on the list. And I explained to her why. But, you know, we've talked about this. She's a Zennial. She says to me, she goes, but why when you say Zennial, do you say that as some kind of mean term? Like you almost use it as like as a slur. I'm like, well, I don't really, but it's really funny how like offended you get if I called you a Zennial. So if you don't think it's, you know, a bad term, why are you offended by being called one? It's just kind of funny. So for any of you who are Zennials on here, love you. And I get why you relate to both so much. And to a certain extent, you know, even me, 1974, there's a lot of stuff, including music, that I love that would be considered millennial music that is being made by Gen Xers, by the way. So, what did I miss? I'm sure I missed something or a ton of things. Always, excuse me. Hey, I made it through with a couple of throat clears and no major cough. So that in of itself is a success. And it means that I am on the road to recovery and there is a road to health that is coming down the pike. You'll see I'm there. Also, if you're on Twitter, I have a post out there. Please like it or repost it because I started to make a little bit of progress and got a like and an open DM from someone, but I haven't heard back. But I'm really hoping that this will somehow pan out to a couple of major guests. But we shall see. They're all very busy because these are actually famous people. Anywho, how can you let me know about High School movies? Oh, by the way, High School Musical, that's just a guilty pleasure. Just going to put that right out there. Not at all our generation, but if you haven't seen the original High School Musical, I recommend just seeing it. It's fan-freaking-tastic. Love it. Absolutely love it. So, how do you let me know? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. You can head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.